You merge onto the highway, check your speedometer, and instinctively adjust your pace to match the black and white sign bolted to the shoulder. But the standardized, federally mandated highway speed limit you are obeying did not exist until 1974. Before that year, the national government had virtually zero say in how fast you drove your personal vehicle. Driving across state lines meant navigating a chaotic patchwork of local laws where your legal speed could change drastically from one county to the next. Who decided exactly how fast you are allowed to travel? And how did Washington eventually seize control of the gas pedal? This is not just a story about traffic safety, but a battle over federal power, state sovereignty, and the illusion of government control. The desire to restrict human speed predates the internal combustion engine by several centuries. Colonial towns frequently pass strict local ordinances to prevent heavy horse-drawn wagons from galloping recklessly through crowded market squares. The town council records of Newport, Rhode Island, from 1678 clearly detail steep fines for riding horses at a dangerous gallop. But the sudden arrival of the automobile at the dawn of the 20th century shattered these quiet local norms permanently. Early cars were incredibly loud, heavy, and lacked reliable braking systems, turning them into immediate public hazards. They shared narrow dirt roads originally designed for pedestrians, bicycles, and easily spooked livestock. Connecticut became the first state to pass a numerical automobile speed law in 1901 to quell rising public anger. The original printed state statute book physically capped motor vehicles at 12 miles per hour in cities and 15 miles per hour in rural areas. Local police departments, armed with nothing but primitive pocket stopwatches, began hiding behind bushes to time drivers between two fixed landmarks. This early enforcement created intense social friction between wealthy, urban early adopters of automobiles and rural farmers who viewed the machines as deadly nuisances. Judges routinely threw out speeding tickets, arguing that a police officer clicking a stopwatch was not a scientifically accurate measurement. Lawmakers quickly realized that writing a speed limit on paper was useless without a standardized way to prove a violation in court. By the 1920s, mass production made cars accessible to the middle class, and the sheer volume of vehicles overwhelmed local authorities entirely. States began drafting their own independent traffic codes, leading to wild inconsistencies across borders. A driver crossing from New York into Pennsylvania would find completely different speed regulations, enforcement methods, and penalty structures. Rather than setting strict numerical limits, many Western states adopted what was known as a basic rule for their vast open spaces. The official state driver manuals of the era simply instructed motorists to drive at a speed that was reasonable and prudent for current conditions. This highly subjective legal standard meant a highway patrol officer could ticket you for driving 40 miles per hour on a sunny day or ignore you at 70. Highway engineers in the 1930s started designing wider, banked concrete roads specifically built to accommodate higher velocities safely. As infrastructure improved, state legislatures faced immense pressure from powerful automobile clubs to raise or abolish numerical caps entirely. The localized engineering surveys of the time argued that setting limits too low actually caused accidents by disrupting the natural flow of traffic. Traffic researchers soon developed a mathematical concept called the 85th percentile rule to solve this enforcement dilemma objectively. A standardized speed study report would track free-flowing traffic and set the legal limit at the exact speed that 85% of drivers naturally stayed at or below. This philosophy essentially allowed the collective behavior of motorists to dictate the law, rather than imposing an arbitrary top-down restriction. The end of the Second World War triggered an unprecedented explosion in car culture and the creation of the massive interstate highway system. In 1956, the federal government began funding wide, multi-lane expressways designed for safe travel at 70 miles per hour or more. Yet, Washington left the actual regulation of speed entirely to the individual states, maintaining the fractured and chaotic legal landscape. Throughout the 1960s, states fiercely guarded their authority over traffic laws as a fundamental matter of constitutional state sovereignty. Nevada and Montana famously operated vast highway networks with no daytime numerical limits whatsoever, relying entirely on the reasonable and prudent standard. A cross-country road trip meant passing through invisible regulatory walls where the definition of a crime changed every few hundred miles, setting the stage for a massive federal intervention. The geopolitical shock that finally shattered state control over American highways did not originate in Washington, but in the Middle East. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries launched a devastating oil embargo against the United States. Overnight, the seemingly endless supply of cheap gasoline evaporated, triggering massive fuel shortages and miles-long lines at local filling stations. President Richard Nixon faced a crippling national security and economic crisis that demanded immediate, highly visible action. In a televised address to the nation late that year, Nixon pleaded with American drivers to voluntarily reduce their highway speeds to conserve fuel. When voluntary measures predictably failed to dent the massive domestic consumption, the federal government pivoted to legislative force. The legal mechanism used to seize control of the gas pedal was signed into law on January 2, 1974. The Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act officially established a mandatory national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour. The original typed congressional bill justified this unprecedented federal overreach entirely on the basis of fuel efficiency, not traffic safety. But Washington faced a massive constitutional hurdle because the federal government had no direct legal authority to dictate local traffic laws. To bypass the Constitution, Congress weaponized the federal budget by holding vital interstate infrastructure money hostage. The Federal Highway Administration grant ledger was rewritten to instantly strip federal road funding from any state that refused to adopt the 55-mile-per-hour limit. Faced with the catastrophic loss of millions of dollars in federal aid, state legislatures capitulated one by one. Highway department crews across the country worked frantically to unbolt and replace thousands of speed limit signs, enforcing the new standard. For the first time in American history, a driver traveling from Maine to California was bound by a single, inescapable velocity cap. While politicians celebrated the projected fuel savings, the sudden deceleration devastated the American commercial trucking industry. Independent freight drivers, who were paid strictly by the mile, saw their daily income plummet as their travel times ballooned. The handwritten ledger books of long-haul truckers quickly showed deep financial losses, sparking immense anger toward the federal government. The anger among commercial drivers boiled over into militant direct action during the winter of 1974. Thousands of independent truckers parked their massive rigs across vital interstate bottlenecks, physically blockading the highways in a series of wildcat strikes. The stark newspaper photographs of these blockades forced the American public to realize the severe economic cost of the new federal mandate. This economic desperation birthed an organized, grassroots rebellion on the asphalt, powered entirely by citizens-band radio technology. Truckers used the radios to broadcast the hidden locations of highway patrolmen, creating a massive, real-time surveillance network against law enforcement. A vibrant underground culture emerged, complete with its own unique slang, explicitly designed to subvert the newly imposed federal speed mandate. The national maximum speed limit completely abandoned the 85th percentile rule that civil engineers had relied upon for decades. Because interstates were physically engineered with wide lanes and banked curves for 70 miles per hour, the 55 limit felt agonizingly slow and unnatural. The official state traffic studies from the late 1970s revealed that highway speeds barely dropped, meaning millions of ordinary citizens were now routinely breaking the law. To enforce an unpopular law that the public widely ignored, local police departments aggressively deployed new, sophisticated radar gun technology. The Portable Radar Unit Calibration Certificate became the definitive proof in traffic court, replacing the subjective visual judgment of the highway patrolman. Speed enforcement rapidly transformed from a public safety measure into a highly lucrative, mechanized system. This technological shift birthed the modern highway speed trap, particularly in small rural towns abutting the interstate system. Local municipal budget ledgers began to show massive influxes of cash derived entirely from fining out-of-state drivers who drifted over 55 miles per hour. The federal mandate had inadvertently created a perverse financial incentive for local police to prioritize writing traffic tickets over other policing duties. By the time the oil embargo ended and fuel supplies stabilized, Washington refused to relinquish its newfound regulatory power. Federal bureaucrats simply rebranded the 55-mile-per-hour limit, shifting the official justification from conserving gasoline to saving human lives. The government launched massive public relations campaigns featuring stark black and white safety posters, attempting to cement the federal speed limit as a permanent moral imperative. Throughout the 1980s, the national maximum speed limit transformed into the most widely violated law in American history. Millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens actively defied the 55-mile-per-hour mandate every time they merged onto the interstate. The highway became a theater of quiet rebellion, where exceeding the limit was seen as a rational response to an irrational federal decree. While everyday drivers despised the artificial limit, the American auto insurance industry emerged as one of its most powerful defenders. The corporate actuarial tables of major insurers revealed that writing millions of low-level speeding tickets created a highly profitable new revenue stream. An insurance company could legally hike a driver's premium for a minor 55-mile-per-hour violation, even if that driver had never actually caused an accident. Desperate to force public compliance, the Department of Transportation deployed a draconian bureaucratic tool against the states. The annual state speed enforcement certification document required local governors to mathematically prove that at least 50% of their drivers were obeying the 55 limit. If a state submitted a report showing widespread speeding, Washington would immediately seize 10% of their federal highway funding. This massive financial threat forced state highway departments to systematically manipulate their own traffic engineering data. The raw radar survey sheets were frequently adjusted, with engineers intentionally measuring speeds on congested urban exit ramps rather than open rural stretches. States essentially lied to the federal government on paper to protect their infrastructure budgets from being decimated. The political consensus surrounding the federal mandate finally fractured in 1987 under immense pressure from Western states. Congress passed a sweeping highway bill that permitted states to raise the limit to 65 miles per hour on rural interstate routes. The printed congressional roll call vote revealed a stark geographical divide, pitting densely populated eastern states against the sprawling open West. The final death blow to the national speed limit arrived on November 28, 1995. President Bill Clinton signed the National Highway System Designation Act, which officially returned the authority to set speed limits back to individual states. The physical stroke of his pen ended 21 years of federal control over the American gas pedal. Almost immediately, state legislatures across the country raced to raise their limits back to 70 or 75 miles per hour. The Montana state legislature went even further, temporarily reverting to their historic, non-numerical, reasonable, and prudent standard for daytime driving. The official Highway Patrol Manual was quickly rewritten to instruct officers to issue tickets only if a driver was acting recklessly, regardless of their speedometer reading. Across the rest of the nation, highway maintenance crews were once again deployed to unbolt the despised 55 signs. They replaced the federal placards with new limits that finally reflected actual driving behavior and the 85th percentile rule. The individual motorist seemingly won this legislative battle, regaining the freedom to travel at speeds dictated by modern automotive engineering. However, the legacy of the 1974 mandate fundamentally altered the relationship between Washington and the states. The federal government proved that it could successfully use infrastructure funding as a weapon to bypass the Constitution and dictate local laws. This financial coercion mechanism did not disappear with the 55-mile-per-hour limit. The federal highway grant contract remains the primary tool Washington uses to enforce a mandatory national drinking age of 21 and dictate local seatbelt laws. The states regained control of their speedometers, but they permanently lost their true legislative independence to the power of the federal purse. Today, the tension between civil engineering and municipal revenue generation remains a daily reality for American drivers. Local city council budget projections still heavily rely on automated speed cameras and strict enforcement zones to fund their municipal operations. The mathematical 85th percentile rule is frequently ignored by towns that prefer the steady income of traffic fines over the natural flow of traffic. The number printed on the side of the highway is rarely a pure reflection of safety or science. It is the visible outcome of a century-long struggle between engineering reality, local financial desperation, and federal overreach. Every time you tap your brakes to avoid a ticket, you are participating in a quiet, ongoing war over who truly controls the American road. Looking at how these laws are enforced today, do you believe speed limits should be set mathematically based on how fast people naturally drive? Or is strict government control necessary to prevent chaos? Subscribe to our channel to uncover the hidden origins and unseen power structures behind the everyday systems that govern your life.